Black, proud, independent, determined, educated, resilient, compassionate, batty, funny, quirky, unique, creative, thoughtful, sincere, loyal, gutsy, vibrant, resourceful, imaginative, engaging, fabulous, awesome. Those are all words that describe me, the Brick City Brown Chick. Welcome to my podcast, What I Know Now. Thanks for listening.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to What I Know Now. I am your host, the Brick City Brown Chick, and this is episode 11, Religious Ambiguity. Now, before anybody freaks out, I'm not going to be talking about religious doctrine or who's right or who's wrong or anything like that. I'm going to be talking about my upbringing in a religiously ambiguous household. And what I mean by ambiguous is not confused, but as different interpretations of religion. For my childhood and religion to make sense, you have to understand my parents' childhood. My mother grew up in the Black Southern Baptist Church, which is very different than, for lack of a better word, the white Southern Baptist Church. They're very different things. And my mother was and is a very devout Christian. My father grew up in the AME church, which I know Black people know what that means, but for everybody else, AME means African Methodist Episcopalian Church. And the simple explanation for what that means is these are Episcopalian people who became part of the African Methodist Episcopalian Church because that was a church that white people created sort of at the end of slavery and after slavery. The Episcopalians created that church for Black people because they wanted Black people to be converted to Christianity, but they also knew and felt in that time that they could not have Black people in their church, in the Episcopalian Church itself. So, hence the creation of the African Methodist Episcopalian Church, colloquially called AME. When I was born, my parents decided that they would have me baptized into the AME church. So I was baptized into my father's religion at probably 6 or 7 months. There's a picture of me and my mother's holding me, so I'm super young. My mother never had any issues with that. She had to have agreed to it, so she was fine with that. And she was fine continuing to be a Baptist and be a practicing Baptist. She went to church every Sunday, always came home with the word or what the pastor talked about. And my father would listen, but he was never a religious person in my lifetime. By the time I was born, I think my father had sort of had it up to here with religion and understood that his child should have a Christian upbringing, but that he didn't go to church. It was not his thing. He had two brothers who were ministers, but that was never his calling. I think he spent a lot of time in church as a child, especially being raised by my great grandmother, his mother's mother, because his mother died when he was very young. So I think they did the Sunday church, Tuesday Bible study, Wednesday children's choir. I think he spent a lot of time in church as a child, and by the time he became an adult, he was just over it and done with that. My parents, who were both public school teachers, sent me to Catholic school as a child. That'll be an episode sometime soon about my adventures in Catholic grade school. And when you went to Catholic school, I'll say back in the day, I don't know if this is still true, they would make all of the children go to Catholic services and ceremonies, regardless of whether you were Catholic. So, as a 6-year-old kid, a first grader, I remember they took us to the funeral of one of the parishioners, which I thought was a weird place for a bunch of kids, but okay, fine. They took us to Mass occasionally during the week if it was a special time of year, if it was Advent, or if it was Lent, like it is now, they would take us to Mass. We would sit out confession, those of us who were not Catholic. And if you're not Catholic and you don't know what confession is, the short answer is Catholics believe that you have to atone for your sins as soon as after you commit them as possible. So as kids, we used to go every 2 weeks. There are people who go to confession every week. There are people who go to confession every day, old school to old school people. And in confession, what you do is you sit down with the priest and you confess your sins, and the priest gives you penance, usually in the form of prayers to say, and you leave, you go say your prayers, you ask for God's forgiveness, and you start over. So that's what confession is. So it was just a very strange, I had some very strange encounters, is what I'll say, as a 6-year-old. And at some point during that school year, me being the independent, determined little kid that I was, I thought, this is ridiculous. Why am I getting dragged to religious ceremonies that don't have anything to do with me? But in my 6-year-old brain, instead of interpreting that as maybe I should tell my parents that I don't want to go to these services, and then somebody can have a conversation with the principal. Instead of that, because I was 6, I thought the solution to the problem was, you know what? I can convert to Catholicism, and then they can take me to all these ceremonies, and then the ceremonies will make sense. That's what made sense in my 6-year-old mind. So I came home and announced to my parents that I wanted to convert to Catholicism and what my reasoning was. And my parents sort of looked at each other like, all right. And my mother said, okay, that's fine. Now, I've looked back in years since and had a conversation with my mother years ago and said, Mom, honestly, why did you let a 6-year-old dictate that they were going to change religions? Because as an adult, I understand just how weird that is. And she said, well, here's the deal. Your father and I felt like you were joining one of the world's oldest religions. It's not like you were joining a cult or some fly-by-night thing. And when you get right down to it, when it comes to most of the Christian religions, it's all pretty much the same. She's like, now I know Catholics do some things that are a little different that the rest of us don't do, but we thought it was fine. You were still going to get the Christian upbringing that we wanted you to get. So we were fine with it. So amazingly, my parents let me convert. My conversion took place very quickly. At the end of first grade, probably April or May, I was baptized. and I had been going to pre-communion classes for several months with all the other kids my age who were making what's called first communion. And so in June, I made first communion that year. So in the space of like 3 months, my entire religion changed. I know a lot of Protestant religions have communion, but for people who don't, communion is when you, in the Catholic religion, communion is when you go before a priest during Mass and receive what's called a host. And a host is a round piece of bread. That's essentially what a host is. It's bread, but it's been flattened and blessed, and it's very particular. And Catholics believe when you receive communion that what you are receiving is the body and blood of Christ. So Christ died for our sins on the cross. You are symbolically receiving the body and blood of Christ when you go to communion. And then after communion, you drink the communion wine. Communion wine's like a whole nother conversation, but just understand it symbolizes the body and blood of Christ. So after I entered into Catholicism as a 6, 7-year-old, things got much more interesting in our house when it came to religious discussions, because there are certain aspects that the Catholic Church has and practices that no other religion does. And I'm sure every religion has their own specific prayers and practices and things that they follow. But the ones the Catholic Church follow are, excuse me, very, very specific. So my mother, being a Baptist, Catholics and Baptists are kind of like this. And I don't mean in ideology, I just mean in practice. And so sometimes she would want to play what I used to call Catholic Jeopardy. Like she'd want to ask me all these questions about things that were specific to Catholicism, which I, as an 8, 9, 10-year-old child, really didn't have answers for. So one very traditional part of Catholicism is the concept of saints. Now, if you're not Catholic and you don't know any Catholics, you've heard saints, you've heard that term, but you might not know who they are, what they represent, and why Catholics pray to them. Saints are people who lived, so these were flesh and blood actual people that lived at various historical points in time, whose lives may have started out not Christian and not holy. They may have been money chasers or prostitutes or fill in the blank, any number of things. But at some point, they were brought to Christ, either through Christ himself during Christ's lifetime, or somehow they were converted into Christianity. And they turned their lives around and they became prophets and holy people and priests and nuns and spent the rest of their life dedicated to God. So the message that Catholicism takes from the life of saints is any person, no matter what you've done in your life or what you're held to account to, can become a saint. You can turn your life around and give your life to God. So those are who saints are and what they represent. And there's a really long, complicated process in Catholicism for a person becoming a saint. There are all these rules attached to it. In recent years, the Catholic Church has what a lot of people call fast-tracked some people that they wanted to become saints, so they shortened the process so that that person could become a saint as soon as possible. One example of that is Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa was fast tracked into sainthood after her death. She is now Saint Teresa. This is also true of Pope John Paul II. He was fast tracked into sainthood after his death. So, what children are taught about saints is these are people that you can aspire to be. And if you pray to them, pray for them to intercede into your life, there is a possibility that you can become what they became, that you can become a person of God. So when you make First Communion as a child, you're asked to choose a saint. They give you these books for young children, and you read about the lives of various saints, and you pick a saint who you feel some sort of connection with because of what they went through in their life, and that becomes your patron saint, your saint for your communion, for your entering into God's love. So that's what saints are. But my mother's question was, I really don't understand why you feel the need to pray to people to intercede on your behalf to God when the rest of us just pray to God directly. As a 9-year-old kid, when she asked me that, I was like, you need to talk to Father so and so. Like, I can explain to you what saints are, like I just did, but I can't explain what you're asking. So she liked to play those 20 questions games with me about aspects of Catholicism, which was just pretty funny. My father, to my recollection, never had a lot of reaction to my conversion. My mother on Sunday mornings, the way it usually went is she'd go to early service at the Baptist church, come home, pick me up, and take me to Mass. Now, Catholic Mass, as a rule, is between 45 minutes and an hour. That's what a regular Catholic Mass is. That's not a wedding Mass, which is much longer. It's not a funeral Mass, which is longer. It's not special Easter service Mass, which is also longer. This is just standard weekly Mass. It's usually 45 minutes to an hour. So what my mother would usually do is stay because the church was probably close to half an hour from our house, so it made no sense for her to go back home. So she'd stay through Mass, take me back home, and then sometimes she'd go back to the Baptist church for the afternoon service, or they were having a special event, or something like that was going on. My father came to Mass. I can probably count on one hand the number of times during my childhood that my father came to Mass. These are always super special occasions. Mother's Day service is a big deal in the Catholic Church. The church I grew up in, Mother's Day Sunday was the day that the First Communion kids made their first communion. So you've got all these little kids dressed up in their fancy white dresses. They used to make the girls wear veils. I don't know if they do that anymore either. White socks and your white patent leather shoes. And because it was Mother's Day, they gave all the children a rose. And so at some point during the service, you would go present the rose to your mother, or if you were a child whose mother had died or was gone, you gave the flower to your aunt or your grandmother or whoever your guardian was. So my father would come to Mother's Day Mass. He came to my confirmation. Now, confirmation, I think, is one of those things that's specific to Catholicism. And the simple explanation of what confirmation is it is your entry into Catholicism as a reasoned, measured adult. So I don't think I can explain it any more detail. That's what confirmation is. You are seen by the church as an adult, as someone who can make adult decisions about their religious beliefs. When I made confirmation, I was 10. I would not say as a 10-year-old I should have been treated as an adult in any way, shape, or form. But when I was a child, that was the traditional age for confirmation, between 10 and 12. I believe they've moved it up now. I believe confirmation is more late high school, is 16, 17, 18, which is much more reasonable. But my father came to my confirmation because he knew that was important. So he would come to important events. But in terms of getting dad into church on a weekly basis, that just wasn't going to happen. What people always ask me about growing up with parents of a different religion, and then my ultimately being of a different religion from either of them, if that ever caused any conflict. And the truthful answer is no, because, like I said, my dad was not a church going person and he wasn't going to do that. I don't know if my mother felt burdened, that it was up to her to make sure I went to mass every week and that I was, going to confession and doing the things that she didn't really understand, but knew was now part of my conversion. I don't know if she felt like that was a burden on her because my dad didn't go and didn't participate in any of those things. I've never asked her, but she's never expressed that she felt that way. She thought it was super important that I have an understanding of Christianity and Christian doctrine and what that would mean to my later life. That was very, very important for her. So even though she liked to, razz me or play Catholic Jeopardy about what we did in Catholicism, that was also her way of saying, okay, I may not get this, but I understand that this is part of the faith you joined and that this is what you need to do. So it was never argumentative or like we're right and you're wrong. It was never any of that. For her, it was a lot of curiosity and trying to understand why Catholics did things the way they did them. And for my dad, he was just like, okay, Christian upbringing, great, good, all for it. Just don't expect me to go to church. that was pretty much it. After I got out of high school, and I went to a Catholic private all-girl high school, which I'm sure will be a couple of episodes at least because there are some real interesting stories about that experience. I went to college and continued to practice Catholicism, I think, through most of college. But by that point, I was starting to have, I wouldn't even so much say questions. I was just starting to have doubts about some of the parts of Catholicism that I found, I'll say, bothersome. And as I've gotten older, that list has gotten longer, but my primary feeling in my early 20s was about the different ways the Catholic Church treated priests and nuns. I think most people know what a nun is, but essentially a nun is a woman who dedicates her entire life to Christ, to God. So she gives up her worldly possessions and enters a convent, and it takes 5 to 7 years to become what's called a full nun. So you take primary vows when you enter the convent. You take middle vows about 4 years into it to make sure you're still committed. And then after 5 to 7 years, you take final vows. So the final vows are the binding vows. Before that, you can sort of leave at any time if you decide that's what's best for you. But final vows are when you are making that actual commitment with your life. So that's how nuns work in Catholicism. Priests, I think most religions have bishops or ministers or whatever word your particular faith uses. In Catholicism, priests are only men. They take a vow of celibacy, among other vows. So Catholic priests are not allowed to marry and not allowed to have children. We all know the controversies from the Catholic Church in recent years about what's going on with priests, but none of that's supposed to be going on. They are supposed to be living celibate lives as men who give their lives to God. One of the things that started to disturb me was finding out that nuns, in addition to a vow of chastity, so nuns are also not allowed to marry, nuns also take a vow of poverty. So people ask me occasionally, like, do you get paid for being a nun? Yes, but not in the way we think of being paid. Nuns are paid in most orders. A particular group of nun is called an order. Most orders are paid through donations from the church, and it depends on how long you've been a nun. So the elderly nuns make more money than the younger nuns. But again, it's not minimum wage. It's not you make $20,000 a year. It's nothing like that. It's like literally bare minimum, because most of your needs are taken care of. You have food and clothing and shelter. You live in the convent or you live in a house provided by the church. So on the one hand, nuns do not have the needs of the world that most of us have, but they also need, money for basics and things like that. So that's always been a big divide in the Catholic Church. It's pretty similar for priests, but I think priests are actually salaried. So that's one of the differences. The other difference that bothers me is that priests don't have that requirement. Priests are not required to take a vow of poverty the way nuns are. And so that's always bothered me, among other things. So I stopped being a practicing Catholic probably around the age of 24, 25. I was probably practicing for about a year after I got out of college. And then I just decided that I'd sort of moved past it, I guess is the best way to explain it. Now, was my mother happy that I stopped being a practicing Catholic? She was not. She asked me on several occasions if I was going to convert and join another religion. And in my mid-20s, that was not even a consideration. I was like, are you kidding me? Like, I just got out of one of these. I'm not signing up for another one of these. And I really do think part of her felt like she had failed somewhere along the way, that I did not take my religion and my beliefs into my adulthood the way she did. But what I've always reminded her is that that's not because she and dad did something wrong or didn't do something they should have done. It's just that I reached an age and a stage where I did not agree with some of the treatment that went on. I did not agree with, I guess the easiest way to say it is my overall overarching issue with the Catholic Church, which would be my issue with many churches, is that men and women are treated very differently, and the expectations are very different. And as an independent, free thinking, liberal woman, that just does not work for me. So when people ask me, okay, you stop practicing Catholicism, does that mean you are no longer a religious person? What I always say to that is, I am a spiritual person. I am not a religious person at this point in my life. I believe in God and a higher power, and that we will all be held accountable for our actions at some point after we're gone. But in terms of believing in a particular church enough to go and tithe and listen to someone spout things that I have issues with, I am not wired that way. I know that for a lot of people, going to church is important. Before the pandemic, my mother went to church every Sunday. Now, at some point, I guess in my 40s, something happened between my mother and the Baptist church that she was attending. To this day, she won't tell me what it was. I have no idea. All I know is that my mother, who was a lifelong Baptist for 70 odd years, became a Presbyterian. And if you know anything about Baptists and Presbyterians, it's kind of like oil and water. So it was super interesting. During the pandemic, I know she went to online church, which that took a few rounds of explanation for her to get the online church thing. But I think at this point, she'll be 90 this year. I think she feels like, she's spent her life going to church and praying and doing the right thing, and she doesn't feel comfortable physically going back to church. And I understand that because she's elderly, she has health issues, and she doesn't want to get sick. But I know she still reads her Bible, and she still reads her books about the Bible. And I think she feels like, she knows where she's going because she's lived her life accordingly. I think she sometimes is concerned about me and how I live my life and where I'm going. And what I always say to her is like, Mom, don't worry. You and Dad raised a good person. I'm living a good life, even though I'm not living the life religiously that you lived or the one that you would want me to live. Know that I'm, doing a good job, doing the best I can. So what I know now that I didn't know as a 6-year-old especially, but that I did know earlier in my life is you can grow up in a family where everybody has different views on religion, and it doesn't need to be a fight. It doesn't need to be an argument. It doesn't need to be I'm right and you're not, or this, that, and the other thing. It really can be a place of learning and understanding and acceptance. And the acceptance piece, I think, is really what we as Americans are missing now. We all want to argue religion and say, these people are right, or these people are right, or I'm right and you're wrong, and all this other stuff. And I think my interpretation of what's going to happen when we die and we all get judged is that God is going to look at all of us and say, you missed the point. The point of all these different religions and beliefs was for all of you to find ways to get along. And instead, what you did is found ways to fight. So you missed the point. And that's just me. That's just my feeling about it. So I want to thank everybody for joining me this week. We're now into double digits on the podcast number, so that's super exciting. And I will see you all next week for another episode. Thank you.